It probably does, but I never do it. I'm always that's always yeah. Is he gonna tell you what to do? It's your half the step of what you were said.
Sorry. Oh, my big winter coat. Well, okay, I didn't bring a different kind of coat, and it's the first coat on it for me. See, Maggie should be Maggie should do it.
Yeah.
I'm not upset right now.
I would think oh, that's not bad. I put this bit in mine. I don't have much of a I don't think.
So, after you go, I was back in the I was honestly debating falling asleep in there again. So that's fun. I know, when I said that I was contemplating sleeping down there again. And I did it once.
Yeah, just do slides.
You're the one that taught me how to do the slides.
And
I remember.
Good notes about 11 o'clock. I'd like to get underway if I may. Today we're going to be continue our discussion really from the post-Roman world. And we had last week said that we talked a little bit about the fate of the eastern part, or some of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And today what we're going to do now is change our geographical focus and begin to look at the fate of Western Europe, an area that we said had been formerly Romanized, and see what happens once Rome is gone. Now, we had said that there are many things that are really going to change the constellation of power and bring an end to the Roman world, but perhaps none of them were more important altogether than the coming of people referred to collectively as barbarians. This is a term that no one likes, but everyone uses. We've been using it for a long time. The term barbarian originally. It comes from actually a Greek term. And it comes from the fact that when Greeks listen to other people speak their language, it sounded like bah! It sounded like a bunch of sheep bleating to the Greeks, so they refer to them as barbarians. That is the actual etymology of the word barbarian. And Greeks felt that about outsiders, Romans overtook their prejudices, and so we overtake their prejudices in turn in the modern world by referring to the peoples who entered the Roman world as being barbarians. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, many of these barbarians, of course, ended up being from modern-day Germany, but really, it was a very interesting mixture of all kinds of different peoples that began to sense the weakness of the Roman world and began to descend into it. And really, in many cases, just coming together to form new groups for the first time. Coalitions meant, first of all, for war, in some cases for diplomacy. And then later on, sometimes the same groups would stay together to rule now as Roman authority is displaced throughout Western Europe. And from right around the year 500, I guess this is a simplified map to give you some idea of what some of the various groups now, in these, what sometimes are referred to as barbarian kingdoms, or sub-Roman kingdoms. And we'll see that, again, what previously had been a united empire now is broken off into much smaller slices, ruled over by various people. Not a whole we can really go into greater detail, but. What we see, in effect, is that many of the hallmarks of the Roman world begin to disappear, along with just the question of the political leadership. That is not to say everything. Again, these barbarian kingdoms, for instance, very often would move into some of the same exact buildings that Romans had previously used, and then they would take them and use them to rule these areas in their own name. So the symbolism of power remains very similar to the Romans. So for instance, now you could walk around and you could have coins that look exactly like Roman coins, save for the fact now that you had a barbarian ruler on these coins rather than the Roman emperor, who of course was no longer in charge at all. You will also, again, all of these peoples still have the same love for jewelry and high status products that Romans did. Still are wearing those or using those. However, there are a huge number of changes in the Roman world. What we used to be the Roman world, I should say. One of the biggest ones was the army. I had told you that one of the biggest things you got with your tax money from Rome was that it funded the army. But now, a lot of these new barbarian kingdoms, well, they really weren't taxing in the same way as Romans were, and they certainly didn't have a professional army. That's not to say that there was no fighting, quite the opposite, but these barbarian rulers expected that the price of admission to living their areas was that if they called upon you, you would have to fight for them and join their army. But you didn't get paid for that privilege. You may got paid when they sack someplace and distribute money, but you're not getting paid just as a salary to be part of that army any longer. It's just not part of the ethos in these new kingdoms. Having much less, having really taxation really fall away too, means that some of those other things that you bought with your money, your taxes, like for instance, public works projects. If you want to fix the road, there's nothing to stop you, but you no longer have the government to actually go out and do that, fix the bridge and things like that. It just made now it's local initiative when people chose to put up those things or fix them. Altogether, we also think that these become very quickly, in many of these different kingdoms, become aggressively local cultures. They become far more rural than they had been previously. People are leaving cities, and they no longer can get some of the same products that were very easy to acquire in the Roman world. Another big change too, and this is one we'll talk about a little bit more later on, was a change in religion. And most of these barbarian kingdoms will in time, they will end up converting to Christianity. So, in fact, this will be a time where finally Christianity as a religion becomes the majority of people in Western Europe. Now, I told you I can't go through every single of these barbarian people who ends up owning land in Western Europe, but the most important group is a group known as the Franks. And you'll hear in this name, it's no accident, the Franks, you'll hear the name France. These are the people who brought you France, and more besides that as well. And this is a much later image of the King of Franks, who really helps to turn around the fortunes of this group. And this is a man named Clovis. Although you would not know it from this lovely statue, Clovis himself was known essentially as a fierce warlord. And he is successful at gaining followers and wiping out the last vestiges of Roman authority in France. He essentially gets rid of Rome's authority entirely in France, and now it's under his authority. And he also spends a lot of time fighting Roman armies, but also other barbarian armies. It doesn't make a difference to him. He wants to be the only ruler in town. And notice that, again, really leadership is entirely based upon military force in his time. After he does this, and again, some of the weapons that this kind of people used. After he does this, though, he grasps this huge amount of land for war. Clovis begins to think about founding a state. And what he begins to recognize was that if he really was going to have any chance of winning over some of the population, many of whom were Christians, who were allied with Pope or Orthodox Christians, he really felt that his only hope was he himself to actually become a Christian. And a Christian, again, of the line who follows the Pope, not one of the heretical Christians, because many of the barbarians were converting to a form of Christianity that would be unacceptable to the Pope. And so, what he chooses to do then, probably again more out, we think, of political convenience than a true religious conversion, is he agrees to be baptized as a Catholic. This is the famous scene where the Bishop of Paris baptizes him and says, you will love what you have burned and burn what you have loved, apparently. And the reason why he does this, again, is that many of the people who are Catholic in France, many of them from a Roman background, at least have some reason to support him. They can say that we share the same religion, even if they didn't like his ethnicity a whole lot. So it was a shrewd choice, really, for a man who you don't think was terribly religious altogether. And what we're going to see then, even after Clovis is dead and gone, his family, in essence, and the later dynasty of Franks that will come in very important, is going to be known as the Carolingians. And they're going to really talk up these kind of religious questions, this is religious devotions, as a way to win over people and to show their devotion. So, for instance, one very popular saint that the royal family patronized a lot, one you probably know from Benedictine, is actually Saint Martin of Tours, who was a late Roman soldier, supposedly saw a beggar who was shivering from the cold, and he splits his cloak in two to give half the cloak to the shivering beggar. But later on, he gets a vision. It turns out it wasn't a beggar at all. It was actually Jesus who he saw in these visions. And Saint Martin is a saint who becomes enormously popular, and really, in the royal family, owns, in a sense, all sorts of churches and places for you to be able to venerate Saint Martin. The Franks will eventually produce, probably the red line that runs throughout this entire family is that they're known to be extremely good at fighting. And then the later dynasty that comes in charge takes over among the Franks is known as the Carolingians. And their founder is this man shown in this dramatic 19th century image here. This is Charles Martel, a name that means Charles the Hammer. And primarily the reason we care about Charles Martel is he actually, in addition to just being a fine warrior, he is actually going to go to battle with Muslims in southern France. And in fact, this is going to represent the furthest that Muslims would manage to make it in their conquest to the west. At least a small party of Muslims had begun to advance into France. Potentially later on, the invasion would have become larger, except that Charles Martel chose to meet them on the battlefield, and he sent them packing, which, again, especially after someone, he was reputed now to have defeated one of the great fighting forces of the world, you can understand how Charles Martel made a name for himself very quickly. And this is why Charles Martel himself never actually becomes king. However, his grandson will become both king and emperor. And this is the man, this is Charlemagne, a name that means Charles the Great. We're going to talk a lot about Charlemagne on Wednesday, but just to give you some ideas why you should care about Charlemagne initially. Charlemagne is going to reestablish for a brief period of time in Western Europe an empire. An empire that was nowhere near as vast as the empires that we've seen under the Romans, but yet one that would encompass a good portion of especially what today is France and Germany and portions of Italy all together in one empire. And you can tell, by the way, of course, that Charlemagne was aware of this parallel with the Roman world. And you can see in this coin, actually, he, of course, is depicting himself not as a leader of the Franks or king of the Franks, but as a Roman emperor. So that ideal was still very much in the bloodstream of Western Europe when it came to power. And in addition to the conquest, again, we'll talk a lot more about on Wednesday, we also see that Charlemagne gets the idea in the ancient world that one of the things you're supposed to do when you conquer a whole lot of places is you funnel some of the money then into culture to make it look pretty. And we see him actually giving all kinds of money to scholars who begin to congregate at his court. And in many cases, they copy some of the great works of the ancient world, the Latin world. And the ancient Christian authors, they read these a lot, they copy them, they discuss them, they write new works about them. They illuminate beautiful manuscripts with the money that Charlemagne gets through his conquest. We see his respect for the book here. He creates a chapel in honor of the Virgin Mary in his Catholic city, which we think probably borrows from a lot of Eastern models, the style of this new chapel that he builds. And we know he got into diplomatic relationships with even the head of the Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and got himself an elephant for the deal. At the end of these conquests, at the end of all this sort of cultural accomplishments that he allowed to happen, Charlemagne then got the sort of honor, the recognition from the only figure really now in the West who could be said to have sort of an international appeal, and that was the Pope. And we'll talk more about the Pope in a moment, but it is fair to say the one of the few dates I'll expect you to know at the end of this class is that he ends up being crowned as emperor of the Western Europe didn't have an emperor for a long time. Now it did again, but the person who crowns him is actually the Pope. So this is a public recognition of all he had done. The great problem about all this is most people tend to see Charlemagne's empire as being a personal accomplishment, but not one that really had a very good institutional structure to outlive him. We can actually see problems already beginning to come into place with his son. You don't have to know the name of the class, but his name is Louis. Louis the Pious comes into place, and Louis, for reasons that are not entirely clear, was either unwilling or incapable of going on the many military conquests that Charlemagne had done, that really had underpinned his entire career. And the reason that is significant is not just because your reputation is gained through battle, but it's also because money is. And one of the ways that Charlemagne had managed to stay in power as long as he had is that after battles, you don't just hoard all the money for yourself. You're foolish as a leader. You distribute it to all the major noble families. Say, aha, you have taken part in the battles, and you get all the money as a result. If you don't go on those wars constantly and pump out that money, maybe noble families are not going to be quite as loyal to you when they're not getting paid off. That basically is what ends up really destroying his son's empire. And in fact, there was already all sorts of problems then, but what really ends up completely ripping it apart is Charlemagne's grandchildren. There ends up being 3 heirs, all of whom want a bigger slice of what had once been the unified empire. And so they all go to war with one another. And eventually all this, after a long sort of bloody civil war, finally the territories that Charlemagne conquered were completely ripped apart. So that one attempt at forming a true empire within Western Europe in this period goes away. Quite really in the space of a generation, more or less. But it wasn't just a civil war that really begins to destabilize Western Europe. In fact, the grandson of Charlemagne had chosen a very poor time to fight because Western Europe had all sorts of other threats that were only being kept at bay because of the Franks having as much power as they did. And so as soon as these civil wars begin to pick up into earnest, what we begin to see is invasions begin to hit Western Europe from nearly all sides. Your old friends, Muslims now, who ruled North Africa and Spain, begin to attack many portions of Western Europe, especially the southern parts of Western Europe, including they actually sacked St. Peter's in Rome, among other places. The ancestors of modern-day Hungarians begin to attack, especially areas of what today is Germany, from the east. The absolute worst, though, attacks were not from the south, and they were not from the east. They came from the north. And this is the age of the Vikings. The Vikings can come from what today is modern-day Scandinavia. And in this period, really an extremely inopportune time, I might say, for Western Europe. The Vikings themselves are this expansionary society. The Vikings have a lot of population, and there's not really a lot for them to do, some of these people, within their original home country, which made invasion of other places almost a necessity. Certainly something that was likely. We also see that this is the great period in which Viking shipbuilding really takes off as an industry. This is actually one of our best preserved Viking ships, the so-called longboats that the Vikings would go off in. And I show this to you in particular because the ships were part of their success. Vikings created ships that were very seaworthy, You could actually go out into the ocean with these, and they wouldn't break apart. You could even take, you could actually take horses on the ships, there was no problem. On top of that, if you look close, you'll see they have a fairly flat bottom, which may not appear interesting to you, but these were not like huge ships that need to be in very deep water to be able to function. Viking ships were created so you could row them into even like small rivers. And the advantage of this was Vikings intelligently now would sometimes just look for an area that had a river near it. They could row in very quickly before anyone could really come and any army could be raised against them, sack someplace, and get back on their ships and then head right out. So in fact, the ships helped them a lot, as well as weapons, of course, too. What we see in effect is that Vikings will begin to undergo a series of absolutely devastating attacks across Western Europe that began hitting all sorts of places. Unlike Christian wars, who at least had some ethics about, for instance, attacking churches and monasteries, Vikings were a bunch of pagans. Why wouldn't you attack a monastery? That's where the gold is. You have to be stupid not to, as far as they were concerned. And so indeed, they attacked all sorts of reliquaries or anything like that. Anything that had gold attached to it, they would take, which made them very rich very quickly. We see that initially the Vikings, I'm just giving you some chance of the northern attacks, but they were all over the place. Vikings initially in places like England first just attacked, and then later on they start to like the place that they're attacking, and they actually begin to winter over and to actually start to form their own little mini society thing. Same thing with Ireland. Dublin, by the way, didn't even exist until Vikings began to attack. Then they form a trading post there, which becomes Dublin. This area here of France that we'll spoke more about had previously been under the French king. Now this area known as Normandy is just taken over completely by Vikings and ruled now as an independent area under their thumb. We always talk about, of course, the more violent side about Vikings because it's fun. But it's fair to say, too, that Vikings, at the same time where they're doing all of this attacking, using the same ships and same technology for that, they also become major explorers. It's actually one of the more interesting chapters of Viking history is that places like, for instance, Iceland and Greenland, which previously basically had been thought to be uninhabitable, were explored by the Vikings. And they formed settlements there. And one of the most exciting, of course, areas about this is that we know, in fact, the Vikings actually will make it all the way into Canada in their explorations. It's actually even discovered some of the evidence of a small settlement that they, for a short period, on Canada. Like most people, they spent a short amount of time in Canada, decided it was kind of lame, they left very soon afterwards, but that joke usually is funnier. In any case, you can understand why many of the natives didn't actually welcome the appearance of Vikings. And it's probably the threat of natives that drives off the Vikings. All right. The combination then of two major factors, civil war that goes throughout Western Europe and invasions, is going to completely destabilize any kind of large-scale government. And in fact, during this period, Europe is going to really, in some sense, the government is going to be reduced down to the smallest possible local level, in which people like kings and emperors will continue to exist, but they're really not going to exert much authority over a large region anymore. And the system, in as much as it is a system that really arises in the wake of all these problems, is something that historians have always referred to as feudalism. Another one of those many terms that no one likes that everyone uses. In feudalism, government, first of all, is at the local level. what we're talking about now is very often local nobles who exert their authority over peasants. And essentially, the way you exert authority is, first of all, through violence. There's someone who has military force. And you'll see here, this is actually one from this time, when the people at the time try to make sense of who is important, the VIPs in the society. There were three different groups. First of all, nobles. And you notice these nobles are people who fight. Those who fight are nobles. The other people who are important are those who pray, people in the church. The other group are those who actually work, and those are the peasants. You may, if you've heard of knights in Shining Armor, you probably have happy associations with them. It's fair to say in this period, knights would go around just beating the hell out of peasants until they listened to them. That is really probably, and when they're not beating up on peasants, they're beating up on other nobles. So there was not a lot of sort of dragon slaying or anything. And that's what nobles did at this time. So one way in which you exert authority through violence, the other, and this is very maybe odd to our mind when you think about what's called government. Another way feudalism is sustained or created really is through ritual. The way people begin to, so you have these nobles who want, first of all, peasants to recognize their authority. And there's some greater nobles who want other nobles to recognize their authority. And the way that they do it is through ritual. This ritual, there's always a higher person and a lower person. The lower person has to get on his or her knees and put their hands like this in front of the higher person. And then the higher person will then take their hands of the other person in their hands to show that there's dominance over them, basically. And the two of them will share a kiss. This is not a romantic kiss, by the way, which would be a little weird. This is just meant to be a kiss to show how close they are now as a result of this relationship. And this may appear to be an odd way for you to relate to people because you're used to having institutions, but in effect, this ritual means is how the majority of people in society begin to relate to one another. Everyone had someone who they had sworn their loyalty through this oath, and everyone had someone higher and below. And knights and everyone in this relationship, everyone was supposed to offer something. Peasants could offer, for instance, their produce from land and service on the noble's land. Nobles were supposed to protect their peasants in times of trouble. Nobles who swore to other nobles could say, "I'll go to war for you if necessary." People in the church could say, "Well, I'll offer prayers for you." But everyone begins to get involved in these kind of relationships. And they actually become far more important than any institutions, really, because the institutions are so weak. This is the way, these web of relationships, the ritual, is what is truly important. We think that the vast majority of people in this system, as in Western Europe, as had been up to this point, were tended to be peasants. And in many cases, of course, peasants had absolutely no choice but to live on their land. But most of them were free. These were not people who were slaves. But it was not, as much as they were free, they also had to do a lot of free labor for nobles. And really, there were very few opportunities for them to leave the system. Altogether, we think for the most part, most people tend to live on the land. There tended to be very few towns to go to altogether. And trading really, which we said has been one of the hallmarks of the Roman world, this sort of scale of trading, the things you could get from abroad, all of that drops out entirely. Now, for the most part, things are produced at the local level. That's as over as much as you can hope to get. Interestingly enough, some of the very few long-distance traders in this period in Western Europe are the Vikings. Although the difference between trading and raiding in their eyes was very small. In essence, you would come to, with trading with arms, and if you thought that the party was small enough that you could take them, you would kill them and just take their stuff. very aggressive form of trading, you might say. Now, I promised you earlier, and I will now fulfill the promise, that in addition to all of these other changes, culturally speaking and religiously speaking, one of the most important things happening in Western Europe at this time is this transition religiously to Christianity. Again, it bears repeating that the classical world does not go anywhere at this period, and you can definitely see that in religion. And as many of you will know already, in fact, the language of prayer, the language of any religious writing in this period in Western Europe remains Latin, the Latin of the Roman Empire. It really was the only option they had virtually, because vernacular languages tend to be very irregular. People tend to have very standardized forms of other languages at this time. But this relationship, this this power that the church gained in this period is in part conditioned by an alliance that is founded between secular rulers, especially Charlemagne and his family, and the church. The church wants to do its work, but it needs secular lords to be able to defend it, or else it has no hope of surviving. Secular lords, especially like Charlemagne, need the church's blessing if they're seen, to be seen as legitimate. So both sides gave them the fact that the church and state really moved very close together in this period. And we do think that many secular lords also think that there's a benefit to having people in the church working for you, because in many cases, some of the few people who were really receiving education to read and write were monks and priests. So we know that Charlemagne and other secular lords would often draw upon people of the church as people who they could actually do administrative jobs as well, not just jobs involving religion. Of course, the end goal of all this is this intellectual effort was not just meant to be just the love of education or reading, but it was really felt that, of course, these members of the church would help them to gain salvation for their empires as well. We do think that at least part of the rationale, even sometimes military conquest in this period, was Christianity. And so, for instance, some of Charlemagne's conquests in northern Germany, he forces people to convert to Christianity after they are defeated in battle. So the point of the sword. And again, it's a much more muscular brand, of course, of Christianity. In some cases, people are essentially, in some cases, being forced to convert after defeat. And really, in time, it's part of the package deal of coming to Western Europe, is that you would be Christian. And even the Vikings, who for a long time resist conversion, will eventually be converted to Christianity as they get to be more integrated as part of Western Europe as a whole. Now, I can't speak about every aspect of Christianity in this period, but here I want to focus just on two that are particularly important for the shape that Christianity takes in this time period. The first of this is papal authority. Now, some of you might say with justification that the office, the position of Pope is not a new thing in this time period. The Pope had, of course, been around for centuries. But it is also fair to say now that the moral authority and the power on the ground of the Pope is changing in this period, becoming much larger than it ever been previous to this. The foundation of the papacy, of course, had a scriptural basis. The idea, of course, of Jesus giving the keys to St. Peter, who seemed to be the first pope. But on top of that, the city of Rome had a very particular kind of fascination for the Christian world. Of course, the place where the Pope was bishop. It's actually it's sort of an irony in a way that because ancient Romans had ended up martyring so many people in the city of Rome, the city of Rome actually continues to be holy as a result of the fact that their bodies are still in Rome, including first and foremost the bodies of Peter and Paul, but also a host of all sorts of other Christian saints. Whose presence there gives Rome this special kind of holy significance that most places do not have. So all of that is still underlying the authority of the Pope. But we're also going to see in this time period some talented men in particular are going to overtake the office and help to shape it. One of these is depicted in a later statue here. This is Leo I. What we're going to see is that Leo I was someone who was very well trained in Roman law. He's actually going to use the arguments of Roman law as a support for the papacy. He's going to say, for instance, just as a son inherits everything from his father, so too are we popes, who are in effect are sons of the pope who came before, spiritual sons in this case. We should inherit everything that came before us. So, in effect, there's this long chain of inheritance that he felt was justified by Roman law. Lest you think, though, that Leo I just would spend his entire time writing theology, he also takes this active interest in current affairs, you might say. And when the Huns are actually outside the city of Rome, thinking of sacking it, he actually he managed to go out and negotiate with the Huns to not attack the city of Rome. Still to this day, we would have loved to know the discussion between Leo I and Attila the Hun was. Must have been quite interesting. In any case, in addition to words, he also brought a very large bribe with him. Which probably helped too. But notice, again, the only person now who's able to do this kind of thing is the bishop of the city. We also see that Leo I is, as I mentioned earlier, he was a theologian, and he really comes up with this very convincing sort of theological proofs of how Jesus can be both human and divine simultaneously. This really becomes a trend among the popes. That whenever in Western Europe people wanted to get sort of a standard sort of a clear theological argument, you would tend to go to the Pope. He really is known for this, sending out all sorts of letters to try to guide people on theological matters. And unlike in the Byzantine world, where many of the theologians were known for philosophical hair splitting, really in some ways the papacy gets known. Here's the brass tacks of what you have to know. Much more so than in the Byzantine world. You just have to stay true to what is in the creed, and you'll be fine, essentially. And Pope Leo I and these other bishops too. What's important about Roman bishops, in comparison to Byzantine ones, is that the Pope has independent power authority away from any secular leader. You often get into trouble with secular leaders, but there still is a clear distance between him and other secular leaders, which helps them to be able to espouse whatever theology he chooses, much more so than Byzantine bishops. Another Pope who's particularly important, you should know it by his name, this is Gregory I, Gregory the Great. These are the city walls of Rome you can see in the background. I agree with Gregory. Gregory, too, by the way, had spent a good portion of his papacy trying his best to defend the city of Rome against barbarians in northern Italy, trying to prepare defenses and stave off attacks. He did successfully. Here's Gregory saying the Mass. What's interesting, too, is that you should get some sense, again, of this from his defending the city, is that really the popes are left as the only kind of major authority standing in the city of Rome when the Roman government collapses. So whether they like it or not, in some cases, popes have to overtake things that previously had been done by the Roman government. So I told you, for instance, in this course previous that Augustus had given out, and later emperors had given out free grain to the poor Romans. But now that the Roman government is gone, it's the Pope who has to overtake those tasks and feed people who are starving in the streets, and come up with other ways, for instance, to help people in the city. So, for instance, using money for new hospitals or churches. It's really the Pope who has to finance that and find a way with the estates of the papacy has. We also think that Gregory has sent out all kinds of letters throughout the Christian world to try to guide people, many of which we still have, which is really very handy as historians. Finally, and certainly not last at all, not least, is that we think that Gregory, seeing the Roman world beginning to collapse around him, quite honestly believed that the end times were near, and that he feared that because he was a person who had more authority, he would be judged much more harshly by Jesus once he got before the judgment seat. And this is why we think Gregory makes an all-out effort to try to convert as many places as possible before his death. And this is why he sponsors a series of missions, monks who will go out and try their best to convert England. And against all expectation, the missions he sends to England really peacefully manage to convert England in really a rapid period of time. And in many cases, the same people who have been converted, the same sort of groups that converted, will then themselves go out to other places, in, for instance, Ireland, portions of northern Germany. What's very important about all this is that these new converts in Northern Europe who come into the faith had absolutely no connection with the apostles or anything from the ancient Christian world. They knew the person who brought them into Christianity. It was Gregory, and more broadly, it was the papacy. And this is really when we begin to see in Northern Europe this much more widespread understanding that when you have to look for theology, you look to the Pope. When you have to get a model of how to practice the liturgy, you look to the Pope. So you become the source of all of these these different ideas in Christianity in a way that they've never been previous to this point. The other main movement that I'll discuss here in Christianity this time period is one that may be redundant here, but it is monasticism. Now, monasticism, the idea that you should go off as a Christian, lead your life away from other people, was not new in this period. In fact, before this time period, as I told you earlier, there were plenty of hermits who would just go off and live the Christian life. The real problem, however, monasticism runs into is that everyone basically decides how to be a monk or nun in his or her own way. There are no general rules and procedures that you will have to follow. And what that means is that in some cases, you begin to see these lives that are that people will undertake that are almost oppressive. People who basically freeze themselves almost, or who will cut off their own genitals, or who will whip themselves until they bleed on a regular basis, because there's no ordering really. There's no centering in all these things. In fact, these ways of life, in some cases, were so harsh that people will abandon them after a time because you can only live so oppressive a life. It's into this scene in which we begin to see Benedict of Nursia come into it and begin to come up with his own idea of how monks should live their lives. And he will actually, Nursia, where he founds his monastery, is where he comes from initially, is close to Rome, as is where he will find his monastery in Monte Cassino. In fact, Benedict will actually end up studying in Rome for a while himself. The genius of Benedict's new rule or regulations for how to be a nun is not that he creates monasticism. There have been plenty of monks before him. And there had actually been plenty of rules before him as well. But as I mentioned, there was nothing very centralized. Everyone would essentially go and do it in a slightly different way. And what Benedict really is just a monk drinking. What's really the genius of the rule is that it's not a form of extreme asceticism. It's not as harsh as other rules. He tried to find a way in which people could reasonably live their entire life as a monk without having to destroy themselves, their minds, and their bodies. And undertaking many things that you probably know well. Living together, giving up sex, giving up individual money, being obedient to the abbot, praying, meditating, working, all of these virtues that, of course, you hear about a lot here. And the work, of course, could take on many different forms. In the early days, especially, often agricultural. As time goes on, the work that Benedictines will undertake can often be intellectual in nature, or copying manuscripts and things of this sort. And, of course, this is the monastery of today, heavily rebuilt. And this is Benedict's sister Scholastica, who we imagine who also had an influence on Benedict in thinking about how the rule might be used also for women, which Benedict himself did not think quite as much about. And the importance of Benedict is that by creating a standard rule that, as I said, had in some ways could be lived throughout one's entire life, really we begin to see monasteries increasingly begin to multiply in Western Europe and use the rule of Benedict now. This was helpful that they also had gotten the support of popes who decided that this is in fact the best rule that one could use. Here's just one manuscript that gives you some idea of what a medieval monastery looked like. What we begin to see is that monasteries begin to adopt the landscape, and to some degree will help to sort of increase agricultural production in the many areas that they pop up. Because monasteries themselves, individual monks could not become rich, but the orders can become rich. And in fact, the Benedictine Benedictines have all kinds of land that is given to them, especially with people as they're dying. It was believed that the prayers of monks and nuns were much better for your soul than the prayers of ordinary individuals. So in exchange for their prayers and hopefully your salvation, people were happy to give over all sorts of land. And in fact, in many cases, monks would also actually clear areas that had previously not been used for agriculture and begin to use it for such. These monasteries are important for agriculture, they're important for travel, in as much as there was any place to stay. For pilgrims, for instance, or other travelers, very often they would stay at Benedictine monasteries as they traveled. But we also see in many cases that monks will, in some cases, and nuns will give out education to certain people, not everyone. And they will also provide medical treatment at times. Nearly all monasteries also will maintain libraries. Really, in many cases, some of the great works that have come before this, the great works of literature, great works of theology, were all copied and preserved by Benedictine monks. And in addition, they would also illuminate books of their own. To give you one of many examples, these images I'll show you at the end here are from the Irish Book of Kells, which these are, a Book of Kells is simply a book of the Gospel, so text that of course we all know, hopefully. But it is illuminated in a style from sort of the local sort of Celtic style. So it's actually a very interesting integration both of words that have come from the old Roman world, but with a style of art that comes from a very new world for Christianity together. If anyone tells you it's the Dark Age, they're just simply wrong. All right, I will see you on Wednesday. Thank you. What?
Today is Monday. He said I'll see you on Monday.
I really have no idea what day I'm living in. That's not a good sign.